Good afternoon. This is Ken Sherman, President of IntelliTrans, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our first episode of IntelliVision, where myself and Brian Cupp, our Director of Operations, will discuss a few key issues of interest to the general business community. Brian, why don't you take a second and introduce yourself?
Yeah, Brian Cupp, working with Director of Operations. I work over the services, head up the services side of IntelliTrans, and we provide services for primarily truck and rail, but a little bit of barge and ocean as well for our customers, about 200 different customers. So we get the benefit of getting to see quite a few different flavors of what's going on in the supply chain industry today. So it's going to be fun to talk about that.
Excellent. And then I'm Ken Sherman. I've been here for just about 20 years. Before that, I was with the GE Plastics division of GE at the time, now part of SABIC Innovative Materials, where the last job I had was running the supply chain for the sheet and film business. And so I've got some familiarity with what our customers experience. As just kind of a reminder, what we do is provide transportation management systems and services primarily to bulk and break bulk commodity industries such as forest products, plastic and chemicals, mining, aggregate, cement, agriculture, and the energy segments. Anything else you'd like to say for introduction, Brian?
No, that's it for me right now.
Excellent. So I think what we want to hit for the first topic today is the Great Resignation. And as being the head of our operations group, Brian has about half the team reporting to him. And then he also has a lot of personnel that are very similar in roles and responsibilities to those of our customers. So Brian, why don't you kick this topic off with your thoughts?
Sure. So, I get asked a lot about the Great Resignation, and is it legit across all industries, or is it just isolated to certain industries, worse with certain industries? And last week, or a couple of weeks ago, I was able to speak at an economic forum, and I was representing a couple different companies with me on a panel discussion representing the supply chain logistics companies, but there were also healthcare professionals that were there, and there were also educational professionals there, and every single one of the companies we talked to and the representatives that talked spoke their number one concern, number one issue right now was labor. Yep. Trying to find the labor. So the Great Resignation is absolutely something that every company out there is dealing with. I was at an event last week, a charity event for one of our customers, and got to speak with 40 to 50 different carriers that were actually moving freight for them. And those carriers all had the same concern as well. They were trying to find drivers, trying to find dispatchers, just trying to find people in general. That's the biggest issue out there in supply chain right now.
Yeah, I can understand, because we've got similar challenges in terms of not so much retaining folks, but more recruiting new staff. And one of the things that people say, particularly on the management side, is that they feel oftentimes it's related to compensation, having to compete for the talent. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, compensation is obviously one of the number one issues for folks when they look at a job. I mean, there's also a lot of other factors that play into it in terms of value. I'm an odd duck. I've been here for 23 years, which when I speak to people these days, there's not a lot of people that have had that longevity at a company. So people ask why. That's one of the natural things they ask about, and certainly compensation is one of those things I've been well taken care of in terms of compensation compared to what the things that I've been doing and the steps I've taken in the company. But also it's the value that we've contributed and that I feel like I can personally contribute to folks as well. So, but when I look at our staff, we have an amazing team that works for IntelliTrans. I mean, we really do. We're extraordinarily lucky to have all the folks that are working for us and taking care of the supply chain customers that we have. They're amazing, but you know what? It starts with compensation. You've got to make sure you're fairly compensating people for the work that they're putting in, and making sure that you're paying. Compensation stretches not only just the rate that you're paying, but also making sure that the hours they're working doesn't dilute the hourly rate that they're making. So there's a lot to compensation, but that's obviously the number one item on the list, is making sure that we're taking care of the folks on the compensation side. One of the challenges with the pandemic has been that we now have competition in areas for jobs that we haven't had before. Right. So when you think about the remote nature of work, and there's so many companies that are now working remotely, essentially, we're now competing for labor with a wider market. So instead of just a localized area in Conway, Arkansas, which is where our operations center is at, we're now competing against companies around the country for those same people. So compensation is obviously number one on the list, but there's a lot of other factors to being happy at a place and staying for 23 years like I have.
And I appreciate you being here that long, since I've only been here for 19 years, which is kind of funny to say, quote unquote, only 19. One of the other things that we talk about a lot is employee satisfaction or engagement, and how to drive that. Because a lot of times what we'll see is that people will get a raise when they leave for another company, but they weren't necessarily looking because of a raise. They're looking because of a lack of engagement with their company and what they're doing. And there's a couple things that I think of, like in our organization, where as a service provider, basically all we are is the people in the company. Our people build our technology, our people develop our processes, our people perform the actual intervention and other freight management services. So they are all we have. So we focus quite a bit on this, especially over the last couple of years. I know there's a couple topics near and dear to my heart currently. One is recognition, and beyond the compensation side, does somebody feel valued for the work that they do? Do they feel seen as an individual, as part of the company? And that can go a long way towards them being happy within the role that they have and the compensation they're at. The other one is developmental opportunities. Can they grow within the role that they have to get even better at the job and perhaps advance to next levels in that? Or are they ready to take on the next challenge that they would like to take as an organization and as an individual within that? But I know you've got a couple of hot topics in this area as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of folks have been asking me that question, especially in the last 6 weeks or so, as things have opened a little bit more up in terms of travel and visiting with people. That's a common conversation I get involved in when we find out we're on the services side of the business is, well, how do you retain people? How do you keep people? How do you keep them happy? And it's kind of sounds a little bit cliche, maybe a little bit simple, but I've told this to multiple people in the last 6 weeks, is that we start by being good listeners. If you can listen and understand what somebody's looking for in terms of their development, all the things you talked about, I mean, how do you know what they want to develop into if you don't start with listening? I think the stat that we've talked about quite a bit in the organization is that 70% of a person's engagement kind of happens with their, in terms of their happiness with the company, happens with their direct manager.
That's right.
And so making sure we have really, really good managers that have time to listen, but also willingness to listen to people to kind of understand where they're at, what they're looking to do, what challenges they're facing. Just being a really good listener is probably the number one item that we talk about all the time with our folks and with companies, is just being a really good listener. Start with that, listen to what they're saying, hear them, and then act on it.
Right. And one of the other things that I think is key if you're just getting started on this journey as a company, some of the fundamentals of, do you have the right tools to do your job? Do you know what's expected of you? And do you have the abilities to succeed every day? And talking to your people about that to knock down those types of barriers can be really impactful.
Yeah, I've been encouraging people to establish a baseline in some sort, some way. We have our own way of doing that within our company. But you need to start with some sort of a baseline to understand where you're at with engagement with the employees. And then once you've established that baseline, then you use that to essentially build upon. But if you don't know where you're starting from, it's very difficult to build a roadmap to get anywhere.
Yep.
So you really have to start first with that baseline, understand where you're at with the company, what are the key areas you need to work on, and then start putting effort on those things and making progress.
Yep. Yeah, I'm really thankful so IntelliTrans' parent company is a company called Roper Technologies, and they're one of the reasons we got into this engagement process through their work across the 45 or so businesses that we owned at the time. One of the favorite phrases from Neil Hunn, the CEO of Roper, that I like is what's called the tyranny of the urgent, or you have to do something every day in the firefighting zone, but don't let it overwhelm you. And so if you think about your operations team, there's always something going wrong in supply chain. I told one of our former employees, hey, if you're going to get wrapped around the axle, no pun intended, around every exception that happens, then it's probably not the right thing for you to deal with, because you'll just drive yourself bananas. And so one of the challenges is we hire great people and we expect them to do things like, hey, let's just revise our transportation network, or reinvent how we do supply chain, or how do we add more proactive customer service. But then they get bogged down to, hey, a driver ran out of hours of service, or had a mechanical failure on the truck, or this rail car is bad ordered, or it's out of route, or it's going to be late to this customer that urgently needs it. And you get so bogged down with fighting those fires every day, you don't get to spend the time you'd want on those more strategic issues, like I mentioned. So how have you seen being effective helping our customers deal with that?
Yeah, so logistics in general is firefighting to a degree. I mean, you're always constantly trying to react and get loads covered, make sure the right loads are getting to the right places in the right conditions. So there's challenges everywhere. You've probably seen the social media posts where, what's it like to date somebody in logistics, and you see this nice little couple sitting there, and but the person's on their cell phone in the middle of dinner trying to cover a load. So, yep. So yeah, logistics is always about trying to firefight. And I was talking to the owner of a trucking company yesterday, and he was saying, yeah, nobody remembers the 1,000 things that have gone right. They remember the 2 things that went wrong. So,
right.
So that's what we do, is we're constantly helping that. I mean, recently, if you look at this, we recently started trying to, we had a new holiday that we implemented as a company to honor Juneteenth. And so that was yesterday. It's actually on Sunday. We decided to have a company holiday yesterday for our employees.
Correct.
But unfortunately, a lot of them had to work to cover loads. It was because loads don't stop moving for company holidays. So, we were able to help our customers with getting through those challenges. But we have another customer that's recently gone through an ERP transition or migration, and we've spent about 10 days helping them get through that as well. So there's just lots of things that we do to try to help people get through their challenges. It's about making sure the right loads get to the right places and the customers are happy.
No, and I appreciate what you and your team have done for both our customers and the company for taking care of all that, so thank you. So I think it's time to switch over to railroad performance, and I'll kick it off a little bit with the discussion. I think anybody that's followed the industry is that the railroads, for the most part, are publicly traded companies, except for BNSF. And one of the ways that they report their performance is operating ratio, which is basically the ratio of their cost divided by the ratio of their revenue. And they've been achieving historic success in driving that down to the point where that ratio is about 60%, or for every dollar they have in revenue, they have 60 cents in cost. And one of the ways that they've achieved that is through this approach called precision scheduled railroading, or where they basically run a railroad more like as a passenger you would think about it. Like I take Marta to work oftentimes here in Atlanta. And if I miss the train, it's not going to sit there and wait for me to catch up. It's going to go, and I'm going to have to wait for the next switch. Yeah. Now, fortunately, as a passenger, it's like every 10 or 20 minutes. So for me, the impact isn't that profound. But for customers, it's much more profound. So tell me a little bit about the impact of PSR on the customer base. Yeah,
the first thing is when I start talking about this topic with somebody that's non-railroad, they say, what? It didn't oprate that in the first place?
Yeah, understood.
So everybody's a little surprised that that's not the way railroads have always operated on that type of a precision schedule. So, the fact that that's relatively new within the last several years is always something that people are surprised by. But what that does is it presents challenges mostly. I mean, we've actually seen quite a bit of improvement from in the middle of the route, essentially from the time that it leaves to from the facility to the time it gets to the facility. But what we call the first mile and last mile is where it presents a lot of challenges, because you've had to change your operating schedules to where essentially you're meeting, our customers are trying to meet certain timelines, and you have to have everything kind of run perfectly to meet those timelines. One of the biggest challenges for all of our customers is footprint. If you think about where most of our customers' facilities are, they don't have a lot of extra land, and so they're working with a very limited footprint. And rail, particularly, whereas a truck you can kind of drive it and maybe you can or can't park it on a nice gravel lot or maybe some dirt. Rail cars have to go on rail, and so there's very limited rail within a plant space or within a mill space. And so what you end up doing is if you miss a schedule and your loads don't go out, then it impacts all of your unloading and loading for that day, for the next day, and sometimes it can cascade for weeks because you just can't catch up. And then what that would do is if you run out of empty rail cars, you don't have anything to put product in. So you can really end up losing quite a bit of revenue and going through quite a few hoops to try to maybe bring truck in to cover that rail if you can't move rail. So what we've really seen the biggest impact on from PSR is that first mile, last mile service.
Yep.
A lot of disruptions at the facilities, getting loads in and out, and we've been as an operations team spending a lot of time monitoring loads, trying to monitor switch schedules, and we've also seen an increase in a lot of different accessorial fees related to that. So if you don't have rail cars billed by a certain time, they just say they either won't bill it, or if they do, or won't pull it. If they do pull the rail cars, they'll fine you a certain amount of money for each rail car that got pulled without that billing submitted at a certain time. You've seen several issues with cross-border documentation as well being required earlier than later, as it was in the past. So you can't leave the facility without having most of that paperwork squared away. And we've seen a lot of different changes just throughout the network in terms of, we did provide, there was certain levels of service provided from point A to point B, and now it's a reduced level of service. So our customers have had to make quite a few changes to deal with all those changes within the industry, and we're trying to do our part to help them with that.
Yeah, and some people don't understand, the sheer magnitude of some of the businesses that we serve, where like one of the steel shippers alone ships like 15,000 rail cars a month. And each rail car holds 100 tons of steel.
Yeah.
And so, to make sure you have a facility that has enough room to move stuff around and meet the outlined schedule from the railroad can be very challenging. It's similar to my challenge getting to Martin on time, right? I got to leave the house on time. I got to make sure I don't run into any traffic, and I've got to park in time to be able to walk into there. I control all of that pretty much. The customers have a much more daunting problem to produce that much product and hit those schedules.
Yeah, and what's challenging with that, especially on the consumption side, is because you're dealing with such large quantities, you can't just go to Walmart and buy a 5-pound bag of flour and deal with your production schedule. If you've got 200,000 pounds of flour moving in a rail car and it's blown into a silo, that silo can only hold so much. They've only got so much silo space, again, back to footprint. So being able to make sure that product's there on time, especially what's really maddening for our customers is to get the product to the serving yard. It's within a few miles of the facility and they can't get it in to unload it. So those first mile, last mile disruptions are huge in terms of that, being able to keep our customers being able to develop and produce the product that they produce.
Now, one of the things I've heard in the press is the railroads saying basically the impact of the pandemic reduced their staffing levels to the point that they're having trouble meeting service levels. But give me some context in terms of the history kind of before that led to this.
Yeah, so a lot of this is tied to the precision scheduled railroading and somewhat tied to the operating ratio as well, is that the railroads were already reducing staffing because they felt like the precision scheduled railroading would optimize the network enough that they would be able to move a lot of the network without as much staff. So they essentially were reducing staffing levels prior to the pandemic, and then the pandemic essentially accelerated that move. I think what surprised the railroads, because if you look at the issues we're having today, which are more than first mile, last mile, there's a lot of service disruptions within the network as well. Almost 100% of that's tied to labor shortages as well. They're not immune to the same things that we've been talking about across all the other industries. Labor shortage is a big deal for them as well. But it started pre-pandemic. It accelerated during the pandemic, and what's actually happened is the rail volume has recovered more quickly than I think they anticipated, and because of that, they're short on staff. And actually, they've asked customers to voluntarily, and in some cases involuntarily, reduce shipment volumes to try to help reduce the volume within the network, to try to make the network more fluid, to be able to move it with the number of staff that they have today. All the railroads are putting out articles about the number of staff they've hired, how fast, but people can't get trained to be a conductor within 3 months. It takes quite a bit of time. You wouldn't want somebody running a train load of whatever product it is in a short amount of time.
Yeah, and the last point I'll make before we switch subjects is that training is also regional specific.
Absolutely.
And so just because you're authorized to run a rail car in southeast Georgia doesn't mean, a railroad in southeast Georgia, doesn't mean you can run one in northwest Arkansas. So let's jump ahead to our last subject. What are things going to be like post-pandemic? And I'll start with, kind of one comment. People really need to view this as like almost like a, unfortunately, pandemic-driven technological leap forward, where we're at today is probably not somewhere we couldn't see ourselves ever being at. Like when I called Delta, like even for the last several years before the pandemic, I was talking to an agent that was working from home. And so we've really kind of made a leap forward that was driven by the pandemic in terms of how much business travel do we have, how much do we have in terms of face-to-face contact, and how much can we do remotely, either Teams meetings with customers or not working in the office. And what do you think about kind of where we've come from so far and where we're going?
Yeah, it does seem to be a new norm, unfortunately. We've had, I think the big thing that the pandemic did was kind of exaggerate that supply-demand imbalance in certain areas. And whereas before you could maybe read it and see it coming a little bit better, where you'd see demand spiking in one area and supply shortening in that same area. Now you kind of see that rotating through different products and different aspects of the industry in general, or the world in general. So I always talk to people about how interconnected the supply chain is. It's not something that's very isolated and one quick fix fixes things. Everything's interconnected, and it's now worldwide. Our supply chain is a worldwide supply chain. So things that happen in Ukraine, some of the geopolitical events that are happening, things that are happening with container shortages, weather events, all those things are huge disruptors, and those have been disruptors in the past. But what I would say now is that you're seeing more spikes in demand that are more erratic than what you've seen in the past. And so having that visibility into what's changing in the world and what's going on in the world, what's changing in consumer demand, impacts our business dramatically in terms of the downstream effects of being able to react to that. So I'd say the new norm is probably some level of an evolving, kind of always evolving, ever evolving change in supply and demand. And it's always been that way. I just think the cycles are a little bit shorter now than what they've been in the past. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. This just accelerated a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, whoever would have thought that a ship turning sideways in the Suez Canal would produce the amount of disruption that had done. So there's some key lessons learned. I think one of the things that we've learned through this whole period is that people have learned that the value that they bring to their company, to the community, to the country, and now they know what they're worth, and they're starting to ask for that. And as a leader, we've got to see the value of our people as well, back to the engagement discussion and compensation, the great resignation. The other thing I would say is, to your point around the new normal kind of being the new normal, not that I like that term, but we're all going to have to basically invest in it, whether it's technology, whether it is designing processes that will work with people being remote versus face-to-face, or even changing your processes, recognition systems, or measurements to reflect that. I know you've got some thoughts on some of the impact of this.
Yeah, I would say, I think it's kind of old school, but the importance of relationship in terms of making sure that you have really solid relationships with your suppliers, with your vendors, with your partners, and giving them as much visibility into what's going on in your business as possible. Because if you see something changing and giving that visibility so they can help, or we can help, it's really important to get that now versus kind of 3 months into the process when you're going, oh my gosh, what happened for the last 3 months? Because by that time, probably some other new challenge is coming up. So
yep.
I think just as that visibility and that relationship is more important than ever. And I think maybe during the pandemic that's been stressed a little, whereas we used to do a lot of in-person visits, now we do a lot more remote. And I think the remotes are very isolated, because you have a remote meeting set up for 30 minutes, you tend to go through a set agenda and you don't do as much active listening. So asking open-ended questions, doing active listening and trying to figure out kind of how you can help in different places. The meetings are very driven by an agenda, and it's da-da-da-da-da, and we go through that list and then we walk away, but we don't really see all the other things that are going on that we could go, oh yeah, by the way, did you know?
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that we need to really stress over the next year or two, is getting back to those kind of deep relationships, active listening, and asking a lot of open-ended questions.
No, you're absolutely right. And as we wrap up, one of the key things that's important in a fruitful supply chain is that relationship of trust between the parties. The shipper, the customer, the carriers in the middle, and third-party, four-party logistics companies, is having that trust to be able to openly communicate, be transparent, and drive that collaboration is going to be much more critical moving forward than it ever has been. And so I really appreciate your time this afternoon, Brian. Enjoyed the conversation. Look forward to doing this again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks to all of our viewers. Appreciate this time this afternoon. Hopefully you found this enjoyable and educational. And I wish you all a happy Tuesday afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.